On a dusty, deserted road, where the heat felt almost unbearable, the world seemed to slow down for Malik. His small feet kicked up the dry earth as he walked carefully, his eyes scanning the ground for any scraps of food or water that might help him survive another day. The sun was relentless, beating down on the cracked pavement, but Malik was used to the hardship. He had been living on the streets ever since his parents passed away in an accident 2 years ago. Despite the hunger, the loneliness, and the endless days of uncertainty, Malik had learned to survive. But today, something was different. As he made his way along the road, his eyes fell upon something, or rather someone, that would change the course of his life. A figure lay unconscious in the dirt, and beside her, a baby's cry pierced through the silence. Malik hesitated for a moment, unsure of what he was seeing, but the instinct to help pushed him forward. He rushed over and immediately noticed the woman's condition. Her clothes were torn, her body bruised, and there were signs that she had been abandoned. The baby, frail and weak, cried in hunger, lying next to her, seemingly unaware of the perilous situation they both were in. Malik's heart sank as he kneeled beside the woman and the baby. He was just a child himself, no more than 11 years old, but the desperation in the baby's cry and the state of the woman in front of him filled him with an overwhelming sense of responsibility. His mind raced as he thought about what to do. He had no medical knowledge, no resources, and no family to help him figure out what needed to be done. But one thing was clear: he couldn't leave them there. Despite his own struggles, Malik's humanity shone through. There was no one else on the desolate road, no one else to help this woman and her baby. He gently lifted the baby into his arms, cradling it carefully as if it were his own. The infant's small, fragile form shivered in his arms. Malik knew he had to act quickly. He looked down at the unconscious woman. He needed to get help, but where? He scanned the horizon and, after a moment's hesitation, made a decision. Malik had no idea how he would manage, but he was determined. With all the strength he had left, he began walking toward the nearest town, his small legs carrying him as fast as they could. Malik's legs were trembling with exhaustion as he struggled to pull Sophia's limp body toward a shaded area under a lone, withered tree. His small hands slipped from her sweaty skin as he tried to drag her further out of the hot sun, but it was clear that he was outmatched by the weight of her. He had only his meager strength to rely on, and it wasn't enough. Her head lolling against the ground, Sophia's breathing shallow and labored, left Malik with no choice but to stop and rest. Sweat ran down his forehead, mixing with the dust caked on his skin, but he refused to give up. He paused for a moment, trying to assess the situation, and then turned his attention to the baby still nestled in his arms. The baby, pale and weak, was still crying, but there was no strength left in the cries. Malik's heart clenched as he felt the fragility of the child in his arms. Desperately, he searched his pockets for any scraps of food or water he could give the baby. But his pockets were empty, save for the handful of coins he carried to buy food whenever he was lucky enough to get a few dollars. The surroundings were barren and the heat was unbearable. It felt like he was the last soul on earth, and in many ways he might have been. Malik turned back to Sophia, his mind racing. He needed help. He needed to get to the nearest town, but it was miles away, and he had no means of transportation. He couldn't just leave her here, not after what he had already seen. The baby was too weak, and Sophia's condition was only getting worse. Malik's heart nearly stopped when he noticed a fresh patch of blood soaking through the woman's clothing. He knew this couldn't wait any longer. Her condition was rapidly deteriorating. Panic rose in his chest, and the tears he had been holding back finally began to fall. But even in the face of fear, Malik kept himself together. He had no time to waste. He had to keep going. Just as his desperation reached its peak, the faint sound of an approaching car made his heart race with hope. He stood up and waved his arms frantically, calling for help. "Please, help! Help!" he shouted, his voice cracking with urgency. But the car didn't stop. It zoomed past him, ignoring his desperate cries. For a brief moment, the world felt like it had turned its back on him. Tears of frustration blurred his vision as he sank to his knees in the dirt. His mind swirled with the impossibility of the situation. How could anyone drive past a child in need? How could they leave a woman on the brink of death and a baby struggling to survive? But Malik's spirit refused to break. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, took a deep breath, and looked down at the baby in his arms. He couldn't give up. Not now. Not when so many were relying on him. "I'm not going to let you down," he whispered to the baby. Despite the crushing sense of hopelessness, Malik made a vow in that moment. He wouldn't stop. He couldn't. The road ahead was uncertain, but he was determined to push forward, no matter the odds. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky when another car appeared, kicking up a cloud of dust as it approached. Malik's heart jumped in his chest as he stood up, trying to gather whatever strength he had left. He waved his arms again, hoping for a chance to get the help he so desperately needed. The car screeched to a halt, and the door opened before it had even fully stopped. A man in his late 30s, dressed in a business suit and clearly panicked, rushed out of the vehicle. His eyes darted around, immediately landing on Malik, who was still holding the baby and kneeling beside Sophia. "What the hell is going on here?" the man shouted, his voice thick with anger and confusion. "Who are you? What did you do to her and the baby?" Malik froze, his heart racing. He had already been through so much, and the last thing he expected was to be accused of causing harm to anyone, especially after everything he had done to try and help. He opened his mouth, struggling to find the words to explain himself, but the man's accusatory tone made it hard to speak. I didn't do anything," Malik stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm trying to help. She's hurt. She needs help." His words tumbled out, desperate and filled with emotion. His eyes began to water, the overwhelming exhaustion and fear weighing on him. "Please, I found her in the street. I've been trying to save her and the baby." The man's expression faltered, his anger melting into confusion as he took in the sight of Malik cradling the baby and kneeling beside the unconscious woman. He looked at Malik as if seeing him for the first time, noticing the boy's dirt-streaked face, the ragged clothes, and the exhaustion written all over his body. "Wait, you're telling me you didn't hurt her?" The man's voice softened, though his distrust still lingered. Malik nodded, his face pleading. "I've been trying to help," Malik said, his voice breaking. I swear I haven't done anything wrong." The man, who was clearly trying to process the situation, turned to look at Sophia and the baby, his gaze softening as he saw the fragile state they were in. His face went pale as he seemed to realize what Malik had been trying to do all along. The weight of the situation suddenly hit him. "I'm so sorry," the man muttered, his voice thick with guilt. "I should have known better." He turned back to Malik. "What's your name?" "Malik," the boy answered quietly, his heart still racing. "I'm Robert," the man said, his tone now more gentle. You've done more than I could ever have imagined. You've saved them. Thank you." Without another word, Robert quickly went to the other side of the car and opened the door. He reached inside, carefully lifting Sophia, who was still barely conscious. He placed her gently in the back seat before turning to Malik. "Get in the car, Malik," Robert said urgently. "We need to get them to a hospital. You're coming with us." Malik hesitated for a moment, but the urgency in Robert's voice made him realize there was no time to waste. He nodded and climbed into the back seat, holding the baby tightly as Robert got in the driver's seat. As the car started moving, Malik looked at Sophia, who was still unconscious, her breathing shallow but steady. The baby, in his arms, was quiet now, thankfully no longer crying. "Thank you," Robert said quietly as he sped down the road, trying to get to the hospital as fast as possible. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been there." Malik remained silent, focusing on the baby in his arms. He didn't need words to feel the weight of the gratitude. All he could think about was how far he had come, and how, just a few hours ago, he had been on the edge of giving up. But now, he had saved not one life, but two. He could feel the importance of that moment in his chest, warming him even in the midst of the chaos. "Thank you," Robert said quietly as he sped down the road, trying to get to the hospital as fast as possible. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been there." Malik remained silent, focusing on the baby in his arms. He didn't need words to feel the weight of the gratitude. All he could think about was how far he had come and how, just a few hours ago, he had been on the edge of giving up. But now he had saved not one life, but two. He could feel the importance of that moment in his chest, warming him even in the midst of the chaos. The sterile, bright lights of the hospital illuminated the hectic scene as medical staff rushed around, their faces a mixture of urgency and focused determination. Sophia lay on a gurney, unconscious but stable, as doctors and nurses worked in tandem to stabilize her, their movements practiced and swift. The baby, fragile but now quiet, was being tended to by another team of medical professionals. Robert stood at the foot of the bed, his hands clasped together in desperation. He paced back and forth, unable to keep still, his eyes darting between the doctors working on Sophia and the nurse cradling the baby in a nearby incubator. The fear and guilt that had consumed him earlier were now replaced with an overwhelming sense of helplessness. "What's happening?" Robert asked, his voice cracking with worry. "Is she going to be okay? And the baby? What about the baby?" The head doctor, a woman in her early 40s with silver-streaked hair, looked at him with empathy, but kept her professional composure. "We're doing everything we can. Your wife and child are in critical condition, but we have them stabilized for now. The next few hours are crucial. We're monitoring both of them closely." Robert nodded, his face pale and drawn, his mind racing. How had he not realized his wife was in danger sooner? How had she ended up in the street, abandoned and alone? His thoughts spiraled, but all he could focus on now was ensuring they would both survive. Meanwhile, Malik sat quietly in the corner of the room, his eyes glued to the floor. The day had been a whirlwind of emotions, fear, relief, anxiety. He couldn't fathom the situation he was in. But one thing was clear. He had acted, and he had saved them. A nurse, noticing Malik's exhaustion and the bruises on his arms from his struggle earlier in the day, approached him with a warm smile. "Hey there, young man. You've been through a lot today. You must be starving." Malik hesitated, looking at the sandwich she was holding out to him. He wasn't used to being offered food, let alone something this nice. He had gotten by on scraps and whatever he could find, but something about this nurse's kindness made him feel as if he were being treated like a person, not a stray. "Go ahead," the nurse urged gently. "It's okay. You've earned it." Malik looked at the sandwich for a long moment before finally accepting it. He took a small bite, the food feeling unfamiliar and heavy in his mouth, yet comforting. He hadn't realized how hungry he was until the food started to take the edge off the gnawing emptiness in his stomach. While he ate, Robert finally sat down beside him, his eyes red from the lack of sleep and the toll the day had taken on him. "I don't know how to thank you, Malik," Robert said, his voice filled with sincerity and gratitude. "You saved my family. You don't even know how much that means." Malik shrugged, still processing everything that had happened. "I just did what anyone would do," he said quietly, unable to meet Robert's eyes for long. The hours dragged on, each minute stretching out like an eternity. Every time a nurse or doctor entered the room, Robert's heart would skip a beat, hoping for an update. It wasn't until the early hours of the morning that a doctor finally walked in, looking exhausted, but smiling. "Both your wife and child are going to be fine, Mr. Grayson," the doctor said, his voice a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "They've both stabilized, and the baby is healthy. You can see them now, but they'll need to rest for a while." Robert felt his knees go weak as he exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he had been holding. The weight of the day, the fear, the worry, everything seemed to lift in that moment. Tears welled up in Robert's eyes as he looked over at Malik, who was still sitting in the corner, eating his sandwich. "You're a hero, Malik. I can't even begin to tell you how much you've changed everything for us," Robert said, his voice thick with emotion. Malik gave a small, shy smile, but he didn't say anything in response. He didn't need to. He had already done more than most could ever ask for. The morning after the long, sleepless night, Robert stood outside the makeshift shelter where Malik had been staying. His heart weighed heavily as he thought about how to approach the boy. He had been through so much, yet still he had been the one to save his family. His chest tightened with admiration, and he realized that Malik had shown more courage and selflessness than most adults ever would. Malik sat on the curb near the shelter, absent-mindedly playing with a small rock, lost in his thoughts. His eyes flickered up when he heard footsteps, and he looked up to see Robert approaching him. The moment he recognized who it was, Malik stood up and instinctively straightened himself, ready for whatever the man might say. "Malik," Robert said, his voice warm but tinged with emotion, "I don't think I can ever express how grateful I am to you for saving my wife and child. What you did, no one else would have done that. You risked everything for us. You're a hero." Malik shifted awkwardly, not sure how to respond. He wasn't used to praise, especially not from people who had everything. I just did what needed to be done, Mr. Grayson. I didn't think about anything else. I just wanted to help." Robert's eyes softened, and he placed a hand on Malik's shoulder, looking him in the eye. "That's exactly what makes you special, Malik. You put others before yourself, even when you had nothing. I can't imagine how hard your life has been." There was a pause, and Robert cleared his throat. "That's why I'm here today. I want to help. You don't belong here, on the streets, struggling to survive. You have a future ahead of you, a future where you can be more than just a survivor. You can be someone who makes a difference." Malik blinked, unsure of where this conversation was going. "What do you mean?" Robert smiled gently, his expression filled with compassion. I want to offer you a chance, Malik. I've spoken to my wife, and we both agree. We want you to come live with us, to be part of our family. We'll provide you with everything you need: a home, an education, a chance at a better life. You won't have to worry about where your next meal comes from, or whether you'll have a roof over your head. I'll help you with whatever you need, and you can be a part of something bigger, something you deserve. Malik stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing. He had always dreamed of something better, but he had never imagined a life like this. His heart began to race, a mix of disbelief and hope swelling inside him. You're offering me a place in your home? Absolutely, Robert said, his tone sincere. I've seen what you're capable of, Malik. You have a future, and I want to make sure you have every opportunity to make the most of it. I want to help you become who you were always meant to be. Tears welled up in Malik's eyes as the weight of Robert's words sunk in. For the first time, he felt the surge of hope that he had only dreamt of. Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Grayson. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Robert replied with a smile. I'm just grateful for what you've done for my family. Now, it's time for us to help you. Malik looked up at Robert, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't alone. He had found someone who truly cared, someone who saw his potential. The world no longer seemed as harsh, as empty. For once, there was hope. The next day, Malik stood with Robert and his family in their spacious home. He couldn't believe the transformation that had taken place in such a short time. He had a room of his own, something he never thought possible, and his life was filled with possibilities. As he looked out the window at the sprawling garden, he couldn't help but think about how far he had come, how one simple act of kindness had changed everything. And as Robert watched Malik, now a part of their family, he knew that the boy who had saved their lives would go on to do great things. His bravery had not only transformed their family's future, it had changed his own life too. Malik's journey was just beginning, and it was going to be a journey full of hope, opportunity, and the chance to give back.